In 1927, a Sears executive named Arthur Barrows paid $500 for a single word. Not a tool, not a factory, not a patent, a word. He ran the hardware department at Sears, Roebuck and Company, the great mail-order empire that sold America everything from socks to entire houses out of a catalog. Barrows had a feeling that the cheap, no-name hand tools Sears was selling needed something more. They needed a name that sounded like it was forged by someone who cared. So he bought one from a small outfit called the Marion Craftsman Tool Company. The word was Craftsman. For almost a century, that word would sit in more American garages than any other tool brand on earth, backed by a lifetime warranty so simple it felt like a handshake. Break it, bring it back, get a new one, no receipt, no questions. And here is the strange part. The part almost nobody who owned those tools ever knew. Sears never manufactured a single one of them. Not one wrench, not one ratchet. The most trusted name in the American garage did not own a single forge or run a single tool line. And one day, the company that built that name would collapse into bankruptcy, while the name itself just kept going, as if it had never needed the company at all. This is the fascinating story of Craftsman, the tool empire that never made a single tool. Before we get into it, if you like the stories behind the tools in your garage, the founders, the gambles, and the history they never printed on the box, take a second and subscribe. We take apart a different brand every week. To understand Craftsman, you first have to understand what Sears actually was. By the 1920s, Sears, Roebuck was the most powerful retailer in the world, and it ran on one simple idea: the catalog. A farmer 200 miles from the nearest real store could open a thick Sears book at his kitchen table, point at a plow, a stove, a rifle, or a wrench, mail in an order, and have it show up by rail. Sears did not make most of what it sold. It was a middleman at a scale no one had ever seen. It found makers, drove the price down, and put its own promise on the box. And that is exactly the model it would use to build Craftsman. When Barrows bought the name in 1927, he attached one thing to it that would matter more than any single tool ever could: a guarantee. From the very first Craftsman tools, the promise was that they were guaranteed, simply forever. If a Craftsman hand tool ever failed you, for any reason, you walked back into any Sears in America and they handed you a new one. No receipt, no argument. That warranty was not a marketing line. It was the entire product, because the tool itself, the steel, came from somewhere else entirely. The man who took the brand to the next level was Barrows' successor, a Sears executive named Tom Dunlap. As America fell in love with the automobile, Dunlap pushed the quality of the tools up, added chrome plating, and aimed Craftsman squarely at the growing army of weekend mechanics and tradesmen who suddenly needed sockets and wrenches to keep their cars alive. And to fill that demand, Sears did the only thing it knew how to do. It went shopping for factories. This is the heart of the whole story. So let me be clear about how it worked. Sears was a retailer, not a manufacturer. It did not own tool factories. Instead, it went to the best independent forges and machine shops in America, handed them a Sears design and a Sears specification, and said, "Build this to our standard and stamp our name on it." Then Sears took those tools, all made by different companies, and sold them under one single name, with one single warranty, as if they had all come from the same workshop. The customer in the garage thought he was buying Craftsman. He was actually buying a New Britain wrench, or a Moore drop-forged ratchet, or a Western forged screwdriver wearing a Craftsman coat. And the list of the real makers reads like a hidden history of American manufacturing. The wrenches and the mechanics' tools came from companies like New Britain Machine, Moore Drop Forging, Stanley, and later Isco and Danaher. The screwdrivers came from Pratt Red and Western Forge. The bench saws and stationary power tools were built by Emerson Electric and King Seeley. The toolboxes came from Waterloo Industries. The hammers came from Vaughan Bushnell. And the cordless power tools that millions of Americans thought of as Craftsman were actually built by other giants, including Ryobi and the holding company Tektronix, and even DeWalt. Craftsman was not a factory. It was an orchestra of factories, all playing under one conductor, and that conductor was Sears. Take just one of those hidden makers. More drop forging began in Springfield, Massachusetts, around the turn of the century, became a Sears supplier in 1938, was later reorganized into a company called Eastco, and was eventually swallowed by the industrial conglomerate Danaher. One production line, forging the same kind of tools for decades, wore 3 different corporate names across its life, and through all of it, the only name the customer ever saw was Craftsman. That was the whole magic of the arrangement. The real makers could be born, renamed, sold off, and buried, and the brand on the shelf never so much as flinched. Now, there is one honest wrinkle worth saying out loud, because the people who collect these tools know it. Over the years, Sears did, in a few cases, take a partial ownership stake in some of its suppliers. It formed a joint venture with Western Forge in 1965, so it was not completely hands-off. But it never built a tool itself. It never ran the line. The forging, the heat treating, the steel, all of it happened in other companies' buildings, by other companies' workers. Craftsman, the empire, never made a single tool with its own hands, which raises an obvious problem. If a dozen different factories were all making tools with the same name on them, how did anyone, even Sears, keep track of who actually made what? And the answer is one of the best kept secrets in the American garage. Sears hid a code on the tools. Look closely at an old Craftsman wrench or the base of a socket, and you will often find a small stamp, a letter, or a pair of letters that has nothing to do with the model number. That mark is a source code, and it secretly identifies the real manufacturer. A V meant the tool came from more drop forging. The letters WF meant Western Forge. BE pointed back to New Britain, and BF quietly told you the tool had actually been made in Japan and imported. It was, in effect, a hidden signature, required by Sears so that its own buyers could trace a bad batch back to the right supplier, and completely invisible to the customer who had no idea the code existed, let alone how to read it. And there was a second layer, for the bigger machines. On the power tools and the bench tools, the first 3 digits of the model number quietly told the same secret. A model beginning with 113 was built by Emerson Electric. 316 meant it came out of a Ryobi plant. 706 meant the tool storage was made by a company called Waterloo. So, the man who bought a Craftsman table saw, and a Craftsman toolbox, and a Craftsman ratchet on the same afternoon, all under one proud red name, was actually carrying home the work of 3 completely different companies in 3 different states. And the only trace of that truth was hidden in plain sight in the numbers printed right on the tools. To this day, there are collectors who can pick up a 50-year-old Craftsman ratchet, read that little stamp, and tell you the exact forge that made it and roughly the year it was made, in an era when the tool was sold as if Sears itself had poured the steel. The brand was a mask, the code was the face underneath, and Sears spent a century making sure you only ever looked at the mask. And that secret had a strange side effect. The same Craftsman model, in the same red packaging, with the same number on it, could be a beautifully drop-forged American tool in one decade, and a cheaper import the next, depending only on which supplier had won the contract that year. 2 tools, 1 name, 1 part number, completely different steel. The man at the counter had no way to tell. That little stamped letter was, in the end, the only fully honest thing on the tool. And here's the part that turns those little stamps from trivia into something almost sacred to the people who collect these tools. Because Sears never made the tools, but it did write the specification. And for decades, that specification was serious. The good Craftsman hand tools of the mid-century were drop-forged, not cast. That distinction matters more than any marketing word ever printed. A cast tool is poured, like a chocolate bunny in a mold, and it fails the way a chocolate bunny fails, suddenly and along a hidden flaw. A drop-forged tool is hammered into shape under tremendous pressure, and that pounding aligns the grain of the steel the way muscle fiber runs through a strong arm. It bends before it breaks, and mostly it does neither. Then the best of them were made of chrome vanadium, a steel alloyed with chromium and vanadium for exactly the toughness a wrench needs when a man throws his whole weight on a rusted bolt. Sears demanded that steel, tested for it, and stamped the words right into the metal. So the paradox deepens. The most trusted tool in America was made by companies whose names the buyer never knew, to a standard the buyer never saw. And the only proof of any of it was a code the buyer could not read. He did not trust the maker because he did not know the maker. He trusted the word. And for a long, long time, the word was good. That is why, today, there is an entire quiet hobby built around reading those forgotten stamps. Go on to the forums where old tool people gather, and you will find men who can date a Craftsman ratchet to the decade by the shape of the logo, the font of the model number, the little letter on the shank. They hunt estate sales and flea markets not for the tools that look shiny, but for the ones with the right codes, the V, and the early markings that mean a particular forge on a particular good year. They will tell you, and they are largely right, that a Craftsman wrench from the 1960s or 70s is often a finer object than a Craftsman wrench you can buy new today. Heavier in the hand, better finished, made of steel that was never asked to hit a lower price. They are, in a sense, archaeologists of a brand that spent a century hiding its own makers, digging up the truth one stamped letter at a time. Sears built the mask so well that 70 years later, people have made a pastime out of removing it. But here's what made the trick brilliant instead of cheap. Because Sears bought from many makers, it could play them against each other. It could demand a better price, a better gear, a better warranty, and if one supplier would not deliver, Sears took its enormous orders down the road to one that would. The customer never had to think about any of it. He just saw one name, one guarantee, and one shelf at the local Sears. The genius of Craftsman was that it took the messy reality of American industry, 100 competing forges, and hid it behind a single word that every man in the country trusted. And trust it they did. Through the middle of the 20th century, Craftsman became the default tool of the American home. And to understand how total that was, you have to understand how total Sears was. In its prime, Sears was not a store. It was the store, the single most powerful retailer on the planet, so woven into American life that its catalog was called the Consumer's Bible, and its buildings anchored the skyline of every city it touched. It sold you your house, sometimes literally, shipped flat in a boxcar as a kit. It sold you the furnace inside the house, the appliances in the kitchen, the clothes on your back, and the tools in your garage. And because Sears reached the small towns and the farms that no hardware store would ever bother with, Craftsman went where no premium tool brand had ever gone. Everywhere. The Sears catalog and the Sears store put a professional-grade wrench within reach of every farmer, every mechanic, every weekend handyman in the country, at a price they could actually pay, backed by a promise they could actually believe. And it went far beyond wrenches. Craftsman lawnmowers arrived in 1934. By 1948, the catalog was selling Craftsman rotary power mowers, and in 1953 came the first Craftsman riding mower for $350. By 1955, Sears had sold something like 1.5 million rotary mowers, and Craftsman had quietly become one of the dominant forces in American lawn care, a position it would hold for half a century, until the name Craftsman on a riding mower was as ordinary a sight in the American suburb as a mailbox. In 1959 came the Craftsman Power Workshop, a single machine that was a table saw, a jointer, a jigsaw, and a sander all in one. A whole wood shop for a man who had one corner of a garage and a modest budget. Then table saws, drills, sanders, socket sets that grew from a handful of pieces into rolling cabinets with hundreds. Craftsman became a complete world. You could equip an entire working life out of one catalog, one aisle, one name. And here is the emotional center of the whole thing, the part the spreadsheets never captured. For a whole generation of American men, a Craftsman set under the Christmas tree was a rite of passage, the gift that said you were old enough now, capable enough to fix your own things. A father handing down his Craftsman tools to his son was a quiet kind of inheritance, worth more in meaning than in money. A red toolbox passed across a workbench with everything unspoken that fathers and sons leave unspoken. Those tools sat in the garages where boys learned to change oil, where marriages were repaired along with lawnmowers, where a man went to be alone with a problem he could actually solve. Craftsman did not just sell tools. It sold the feeling of a country that still made things, still fixed things, still believed that a working man's hands were worth good steel. That feeling is why, decades later, grown men get a catch in their throat talking about a wrench. And it is why what happened next hurt the way it did. And holding all of it together, the true product was that warranty. Say it plainly, because it was almost unbelievable. A man could buy a Craftsman hand tool, use it hard for 30 years, snap it clean in half, walk into any Sears in America with no receipt, no proof of purchase, no story, and walk out with a brand new one, free. No questions asked, not repaired, replaced. It did not matter if his father had bought it. It did not matter if he had bought it. It did not matter if it was rusted or abused or older than the clerk handing him the new one. The words were for any reason, and Sears meant them. Think about what that guarantee actually was underneath. It was Sears telling every customer, you do not need to know who made this, or how, or where, or from what steel, because we are standing behind it forever, and forever has no fine print. It was the answer to the entire paradox of Craftsman. Of course, the buyer did not care that the tool came from a dozen anonymous forges under a dozen forgotten names. Why would he? If it ever failed, the tool became Sears' problem, permanently and completely. The warranty made the hidden factory irrelevant. It turned a pile of contracted steel into something that felt like a covenant. That is why men swapped stories about it like folklore. The ratchet returned after 40 years. The wrench a grandfather bought replaced for a grandson. That promise turned a collection of parts made by strangers into something that felt permanent and American and safe. Something you could count on when nothing else in the economy seemed built to last. The guarantee was the soul of the brand, which is exactly why the way it died tells you everything. It is worth stopping here to see just how strange Craftsman was by holding it up against the tool brands that did it the other way. Think about Snap-on, the brand of the professional mechanic. Snap-on forges its own tools in its own plants and sells them off its own trucks. And every part of that chain, the steel, the making, the selling, is Snap-on, or Milwaukee, or Makita, companies with factories you can photograph, engineers you can name, a physical place where the thing is born. Those are tool companies in the ordinary sense. They make tools. Craftsman made nothing. It was the exact inverse. A tool brand that was pure brand, 100% trust, and 0% forge. And for most of a century, astonishingly, the inverse won. Craftsman outsold the companies that actually made things because it had cracked a secret they never did, that for the man in the garage, the promise mattered more than the plant. He did not need to know his tool was born in a specific building by specific hands. He needed to know that if it broke, someone would make it right, forever. Snap-on sold the mechanic the best tool. Craftsman sold everyone else the safest bet. And there were a great many more everyone else's than there were professional mechanics. That was the whole game, and Craftsman played it better than anyone in history, right up until the moment the promise underneath it started to crack. So how does an empire like that fall apart? Slowly, and then all at once. And it started with a bitter kind of symmetry from the very same instinct that had built it, the relentless, restless drive to push the price down. For decades, squeezing suppliers had been Sears' superpower, And it had worked because there was always another American forge down the road, hungry for the volume, willing to sharpen the price. But in the 1980s and 90s, the road got longer. It ran across an ocean. Foreign factories, and increasingly Chinese ones, could make a serviceable wrench for a fraction of what a New England forge charged. And the same relentless pressure that had once forced American suppliers to build better now forced them, one by one, to lose the contract entirely. The forges that had stamped a V or AWF, the Made in America shops that had spent decades earning that little code, started watching the enormous Sears orders sail away, and the steel in the red wrench was no longer guaranteed to be American steel, or forged steel, or the steel it used to be. Here is where the hidden maker system turned from genius into quiet poison. Because the customer only ever saw the name, Sears could change what stood behind that name without telling anyone. The same model number, the same red packaging, the same place on the same shelf, now filled with a tool from a different country, a different process, a different grade. There was no announcement. There could not be. The whole architecture of Craftsman was built on the buyer not knowing who made his tool. And now that architecture was being used to swap the good tool for a cheaper one while keeping the price and the promise looking the same. In 2004, the cracks went public. Sears was hit with a class action lawsuit accusing it of false advertising, of leaning on that patriotic made in USA image for Craftsman, while more and more of the tools were quietly coming from abroad. The name still said Craftsman. It still said, on some packages, Made in America. What actually stood behind it was changing, part by part, year by year, and the men who noticed first were exactly the ones who cared most. The tradesmen who had grown up on the old steel and could feel the difference in their hands the moment they picked up the new. And they did more than feel it. They documented it. Go into the old tool corners of the internet, and you will find a strange kind of forensic accounting. Men who took the new Craftsman and the old Craftsman apart side by side, weighed them, measured the wall thickness of the sockets, compared the finish, tracked exactly which model numbers had quietly moved offshore and in which year. They were not doing it to complain, or not only. They were doing it because they loved the tools, and watching a brand you trusted get hollowed out from the inside, one part number at a time, while the packaging stayed cheerful and the price stayed high, is its own particular heartbreak. These were the people Craftsman had been built for, the ones who had believed the word longest. And they were the first to understand that the word and the steel had come apart, that you could no longer assume the thing in the red package was the thing your father had owned. The trust that took 90 years to build was being spent, quietly, to shave a few cents off a wrench. Then the warranty itself, the soul of the whole thing, began to erode, and it eroded in exactly the way souls erode. Quietly, one small compromise at a time, each one defensible on its own, all of them fatal together. Remember what the promise had been, for any reason. No receipt, no questions, forever. Around 2009, Sears stores started enforcing limits that had never been part of that promise. Clerks began turning away tools that were too rusty, as if rust on a tool that had lived 30 honest years in a garage were some kind of abuse, rather than proof the thing had been used exactly as intended. Stores started capping returns at 3 tools a day. In 2012, the lifetime guarantee on lawn and garden equipment was quietly cut down to 25 years. And now, suddenly, you needed a receipt for a machine you might have bought 2 decades earlier from a store that might no longer exist. Each change had a reason. Costs were rising, abuse was real, the company was bleeding money. But add them up and you get something unforgivable to the people who cared. The handshake was becoming fine print. The covenant was becoming a policy. And the loyal ones, the men who had trusted the word their whole lives, the ones who had inherited their father's sets and expected to hand them to their own children under the same promise, they noticed. Of course they noticed. The warranty was the only reason they had ever stopped asking who really made the tool. Weaken the warranty, and the whole 100-year trick starts to show through. A man standing at a Sears counter being told his broken ratchet did not qualify was not just losing a wrench. He was watching a promise his father had believed get downgraded to a coupon in real time. But the deepest problem was never the tools, or even the warranty. It was the empire that owned them. Sears itself was dying, and it was dying for reasons that had nothing to do with Craftsman, and everything to do with the century turning over. The catalog that built Sears had been the internet of its day, the way a farmer in Nebraska reached the whole world of goods. And now an actual internet had arrived to do the same thing infinitely faster. Big box stores and discount chains ate the middle. Sears, the giant that had been everything to everyone, slowly became nothing in particular to anyone. And in 2005, a struggling Kmart, controlled by the hedge fund manager Eddie Lampert, merged with Sears in a deal worth around $11 billion, creating Sears Holdings, with Lampert at the top promising to turn the whole thing around. He did not turn it around. What happened instead has become a case study in how to strip a great company for parts. Critics would come to say that Lampert ran Sears less like a retailer and more like a portfolio of real estate and brands to be sold, that the stores themselves were starved of investment, left dim and understocked and unloved while the valuable pieces were spun off and sold. Whether that is entirely fair or not, the result on the ground was undeniable. Year after year, stores closed. Shelves sat half empty. The company that had once sold America, its houses and its dreams, became a place people were faintly surprised to learn was still open. And as Sears sank toward the bottom, it was sitting on one asset still worth a genuine fortune. One thing the decades had not tarnished. The name Arthur Barrows had bought for $500 in 1927. In the wreckage of the greatest retailer in American history, the most valuable thing left was a word stamped on a wrench. And here is what made that name so valuable, and so trapped at the same time. Craftsman had been tied to Sears for so long that even at the end, around 90% of all Craftsman products were still sold only inside Sears stores. A brand that lived in nearly every garage in America was almost completely locked to one dying retailer. Outside of Sears, it moved only about $200 million a year. So, as the stores went dark, one of the most trusted names in the country was being dragged down with a company it had quietly outgrown decades before. Something had to give. So in January 2017, Sears did the thing it had spent decades unable to imagine. It sold Craftsman, Stanley Black, and Decker, one of the largest tool companies on Earth. The same conglomerate that by then owned DeWalt and a dozen other names, agreed to buy the brand for about $900 million. Not $900 million for factories or machines or inventory, remember? Because there were none of those. $900 million for a word and the trust attached to it. The structure of the deal told its own story. $525 million in cash up front, another $250 million paid 3 years later, plus a stream of royalties on future sales. Now hold that $900 million up against the $500 Arthur Barrows paid for the same name in 1927. Even across 90 years of inflation, that is one of the great returns in the history of American branding. A $500 word that grew into a $900 million asset, all without the company ever forging a single tool. And the arrangement had one last twist. And it is the kind of detail that tells you exactly how far the mighty had fallen. As part of the sale, Sears kept the right to keep selling Craftsman tools in its own dying stores, but only for a limited time. And then, on future sales, Sears would have to pay a royalty back to Stanley Black and Decker. Read that slowly. Sears, the company that had invented Craftsman, built it, made it a household word across 100 million garages, was now a licensee, paying a fee to somebody else for the privilege of selling the brand it had created. The empire was renting back its own name. The parent was paying rent to the child. There is no cleaner image of an era ending than that, and the timing was almost unbelievable. Because just over a year later, in October 2018, Sears Holdings finally filed for bankruptcy. Chapter 11. The Catalog Empire, the company that had sold America its tools, its appliances, and its dreams for more than a century, collapsed. But Craftsman did not go down with it. The brand had been sold off the year before, lifted out of the sinking ship just in time. The store died. The name lived. Exactly as it always had, Craftsman survived without the company behind it, because it had never really depended on that company's hands in the first place. Stanley Black and Decker, the new owner, understood exactly what it had bought. It had not bought factories, because there were none. It had not bought patents or machines or a workforce. It had bought the word and the century of trust baked into it, and the tens of millions of American garages with a Craftsman toolbox already sitting in the corner. And it set out to do something Sears, in 90 years, had never once done. It tried to bring Craftsman home, to actually make the tools, itself, in America. In 2019, the company announced a $90 million plant in Fort Worth, Texas, a 400,000 square foot factory built to stamp out Craftsman sockets, ratchets, and wrenches, automated, modern, and proudly stamped made in the USA, with around 500 jobs. Listen to the poetry of that for a second. For its entire existence, Craftsman had been a brand with no factory, a name renting other men's steel. Now, at last, someone was going to build an actual house for it, to forge the red wrench on American soil under its own roof. For a moment, it looked like the story might finally close the loop. And then, in 2023, they shut it down. The automation never hit the volumes the numbers required. One of the largest, most sophisticated tool companies on the entire planet had tried to do the one thing Sears had spent a century avoiding: make a wrench in America at scale, and it could not make the arithmetic work. The factory closed, and in that failure, there is a strange, backhanded vindication of old Arthur Barrows. Maybe Sears never built the tools, because building the tools, at that price, in this country, was the hardest part of all. The part best left to whoever could do it cheapest that year. Maybe the genius was never in the forge. Maybe it was always, only, in the name. And what of the old tools? The real ones, the drop-forged American craftsmen from before all of this. Here the story takes a turn the accountants never predicted. They became treasure. Not museum treasure, not auction house money, but something better and more honest. Working treasure. Walk any estate sale, any flea market, any Saturday yard sale in America, and you will find men, and increasingly younger men, hunting specifically for old craftsmen. The tools with the right stamps, the ones made in the good years by the good forges. They buy them not to display, but to use, because a properly made 1970s Craftsman ratchet will very likely outlast anything at the same price sold new today. An entire second life has grown up around these tools. Restorers who strip and clean them, collectors who decode the markings, tradesmen who quietly prefer them. The market voted, and its verdict is devastating in its simplicity. The old Craftsman, the one nobody was told the maker of, is often the better tool. The brand spent 100 years teaching Americans to trust a name over a maker. And now, at the end, the people who love these tools most have flipped it completely. They have learned to read the maker's secret code and buy the steel, not the word. The mask has become the map. So here is where the empire stands today. Craftsman still exists, owned now by Stanley Black and Decker. Sold not at Sears, which is mostly a memory of a memory, but at Lowe's, at Ace Hardware, wherever the new owner can place it. Some of its tools are made in America again. Many are not. And the source, as ever, is not something the shelf will tell you. The lifetime warranty still covers the core hand tools, though it carries more conditions and more fine print than the old handshake ever did. And the brand floats on, exactly as it always has, attached to no single factory, carried by whatever makers win the contracts, held together by one word and one promise, both of them a little thinner than they were, but both of them still, remarkably, alive. Because that was always the real secret of Craftsman. It was never a factory. It was never a forge. It was never a place at all. It was an idea that a Sears executive bought for $500 in 1927 and wrapped around the best tools it could buy that year, a name and a guarantee stamped onto other men's steel. It never made a single tool. Not one. It never had to. The tool was never the product. The trust was the product. And the tool was just the thing the trust happened to be attached to. And maybe that is the strangest and the most modern lesson in this whole story, because we live now in a world full of craftsmans, brands that make nothing, own no factory, and are worth billions purely because a name on a box means something to a stranger. Craftsman got there first, and it got there with a wrench. It proved for 100 years that the most valuable thing a company can own is not a machine or a patent or a building, but a feeling in the chest of an ordinary man when he reaches for a familiar red handle. The company that owned that feeling could be sold. The stores that carried it could go dark. The factories could move across the ocean and back and fail and close. And through all of it, the name survived, because you cannot bankrupt a promise. You cannot repossess a memory, and you cannot foreclose on the meaning of the word your father used. You can only wear that meaning down, slowly, one broken guarantee and one cheaper batch of steel at a time. Craftsman is still here, thinner than it was, hazier about who makes it than ever, but still standing in 10,000 garages, still stamped on the ratchet in the drawer. A tool empire that never made a single tool and could not quite be killed, because it was never really made of steel in the first place. It was made of trust. And trust, it turns out, is the one thing that outlives the company that sold it. If you enjoyed the story of Craftsman, consider subscribing. Every week, we take apart another tool brand you thought you knew. And tell me down in the comments, what is the oldest Craftsman tool still sitting in your garage? And did you ever find the secret little letter stamped on it? Because next time, we look at a tool brand that did the opposite of Craftsman. It was declared dead, its name buried completely, and then it was dug back up and turned into one of the most recognized names in America all over again.